Hi, everybody. In this video, I want to give a bit more explanation about how I supervise business model theses at my chair. Before I go into that, let me briefly introduce myself. So I'm Dries Vaams, Professor of Entrepreneurship, Innovation and Technological Transformation at WHU. And so I mainly supervise business model development theses. So these are theses where you will develop and further test a specific business model for a startup or a venture. And the structure of a business model thesis at my chair typically looks as follows. So you will have to write an introduction. Then I expect you to do some discovery research. Subsequently, you need to leverage that research to describe a business model canvas. And as a next step, I expect from you that you will identify two core hypotheses behind your business model and test these hypotheses with actual experiments. So you really need to collect real-time data on your business model. And finally, based on the results of this hypothesis testing, I expect from you a reflection on your initial ideas of your business model. So let me briefly go through the different sections so that you have a better understanding about what is exactly expected from you. So in the introduction section, I expect that you already briefly describe the pain point that you want to solve. Yeah? So what is the problem that you want to address? What is your current idea about which kind of business do you want to develop to address this problem? And in the introduction, it's also nice to kind of give an outline of the next sections in your thesis. So these should be the three elements in the introduction section. Subsequently, we will go to the first kind of empirical section, so the research discovery section. So here you will do some first research on the pain points that you have identified. You want to explore the market for your business model. Of course, you also want to identify competitors. And I want to see a reflection on the key assets that you have to develop this business model. So in terms of pain points, what do I expect from you? I think it's crucial that you get a very deep understanding about the problem that you want to solve. So you will already have an idea about which problem to solve, but now you need to get a deeper understanding. And this you need to do by means of customer interviews. And you can actually do two types of customer interviews at this stage. You can do what we call synthetic customer interviews. And that means you can leverage generative AI to do customer interviews with ChatGPT. And I actually will have a separate video to explain you how you can do that. And at this stage, I also expect from you that you will collect data from real people on the problems that they experience. So both synthetic and interviews with real people are important here. When you have done these interviews, you need to transcribe them because that you will need to submit separately to the thesis. And of course, I then want to see an analysis. So what did you learn from these interviews? And here it will be important to provide explicit quotes from your synthetic and real interviews so that I can understand the core learnings that you had out of these pain point-oriented customer interviews. Next, I also want you to do a market analysis in this research stage. So here you have to do some research on what is actually the size and the scope of the market opportunity. And of course, it's here important that you use validated sources like reports from consulting agencies or academic reports. And you definitely need to make sure that you adequately cite them according to the guidelines that we provide. Next, you also need to identify competitors. Yeah, so it's important to think about who is actually the competition, which companies are offering similar value propositions, which companies are addressing similar pain points, which customers are targeting similar customers. And again, here, generative AI can be a valuable tool, and I will have a separate video to explain how you can use generative AI to easily identify and analyze competitors. And so in the end, in the thesis, you need to clearly identify competitors and analyze them so that you can clearly explain how you differentiate from existing solutions. And finally, I also want you to do a reflection on your key assets. And that means what are specific experiences, skills, or connections that you already possess that make you well suited to execute this business model. Yeah, we want to have what is called founder market fit. So you would need to have specific skills, experiences, connections that put you in pole position to develop this business model. And so I also want you to reflect on that in the research section of the thesis. When you finish your research, it's time to systematically describe your business model, and this we will do using the business model canvas. So this is a very nice tool to systematically describe the whole business model. So in this section, I expect from you a clear, systematic description of all the elements of the business model canvas. At this stage, I also want to see a rich description of the actual product that you will deliver, and you need to show that to me by means of a minimal viable product. It can be a landing page or a kind of mock-up of a prototype, but in one way or another, I need to see the business that you want to demonstrate to me. So these are three important elements for this section. And when you have developed that, we can go to the next section where you will have to develop core hypotheses. And so I expect from you that you will identify and test two hypotheses. And these should be hypotheses related to the desirability and the viability of your business model. Yeah, so it's not hypotheses about nitty-gritty features. No, it's about the fundamental assumptions behind your business model. And again, I will provide a more extensive video to explain how to identify hypotheses. To test the hypotheses, you can rely on a number of experimental approaches. So it might be that you do A/B testing or conjoint experiments or surveys. So these are quantitative approaches you can use. But also at this stage, you can do interviews, or you could even do kind of an observation study that would be more qualitative data collection. Whatever approach you choose, if you do quantitative research, it will be important to have a large enough sample size so that you can make statistical significant claims. Yeah? So you cannot make any claims on a survey with 10 people. Then the added value of the survey will be very limited. If you do qualitative research, then it's very important to collect in-depth information. Yeah, so the number of interviewees will typically be quite limited, like 5-10 people at this stage, but then I want to see very deep understandings. Yeah, so if you go for quantitative research, make sure that you have sufficient responses to make statistical claims. When you do qualitative research, it's very important to give you deep understanding of the data that you collected. And so you will have to think about which approach actually fits with the type of hypotheses that I formulated. Now, again, I will also give some examples of best practice theses when you do the thesis so that you can get a better understanding about what kind of tools you could apply. In the end, the final section is a reflection section. So there you simply have to reflect on the hypotheses. Yeah? So what insights did you gain from these experiments? To what extent do they push you to change your initial business model idea? And here you can also reflect on the next steps that you want to take in developing your business model. Yeah, so we do a kind of first iteration in the thesis. You have come up with an initial business model, further developed it based on research, and then you have tested some core assumptions. So in the end, you need to describe to me, what did I learn from this and how do I want to move forward? It might be that the conclusion is that it's time to stop. If the hypotheses and the testing show that it might actually be less promising than you initially expected, that could be a valid conclusion, and that's perfectly okay. I do not grade the level of success of your startup. What I grade is the quality of your testing, the quality of your hypothesis formulation. That's very important, not the success, because that to some extent is whether you got lucky or not. In terms of the supervision process, I apply a very structured approach. So we will, when you start with your thesis, we will have a kick-off meeting where you have the opportunity to ask some additional questions about this process. Then, when you have finished the research and the business model canvas description, you can send that a first draft to me. I will take a look, and then we can have a feedback session to give you some feedback, but also discuss the next step, namely the hypothesis identification and testing. And based on that information, you should be able to then independently execute and finalize the thesis. Of course, if in between you have some specific questions, you can always reach out to me. But so we will have kind of two formal meeting moments in the thesis process. And as mentioned, you will also be added to a Teams group where you will find a lot of additional resources. So I will have there references to the videos that I added about how to do interviews with generative AI, how to identify competitors with generative AI. I will also have a video on how to formulate and test hypotheses. And you will also find in the Teams group some best practice examples of thesis so that you can see what other students have done. How will I grade the thesis? So in the end, all the sections will be part of the grading. So simply, I will look at all the sections and grade them accordingly. As mentioned before, I do not grade whether your hypotheses were confirmed or disconfirmed. And what I will grade is the quality of the actual testing. Yeah? And so there is a strong emphasis on your ability to analyze and reflect on the data that you have collected. Yeah? So make sure that you make valid statements. Yeah? So if you want to talk about differences between groups, make sure that you talk about statistical differences. Yeah? So you need to do some basic statistical tests to claim that there is a statistical difference. And if you use interviews, you need to make sure that you show me quotes from the interviews that kind of support your claims. Yeah? In the end, what do you need to deliver? So you need to deliver a thesis that is maximum 40 pages. Yeah? So in the end, we have here a maximum, not a minimum. In terms of guidelines, as a chair, I don't have specific guidelines, just follow the overall guidelines in terms of how to structure a thesis, but also how you should cite resources. And we have given you quite some material in that respect. If you do interviews, make sure that you provide me with the names and the functions of these people. That can be within the thesis if you're allowed to do so. Otherwise, you need to give me a separate document. If you do interviews, you always need to have approval from the interviewees that you can use the data for your thesis. And there is a separate kind of approval document that you can get via the administration. We also need the recordings or transcripts for your interviews as proof that you really did these interviews. Also, if you do synthetic interviews with ChatGPT, make sure that you have a transcript of that synthetic interview because these are also data. And when you collect data in a quantitative manner, if you do surveys or experiments, also there you will need to provide the raw data so that we can double check. So you have the thesis document as such, but on top of that, when you submit your final thesis, you will have to submit quite some additional documents as mentioned here. So this was kind of an overview of what is expected from you when you want to do a thesis at my chair. So if you're interested, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I hope that this gives the necessary insight in what is exactly expected from you. Okay, thank you for your attention.